Twice, on October 10th and 12, we radioed messages to the army commanders of the surrounded forces. These messages contained brief information on the enemy and the assignment of breakthrough missions under the overall control of General M.F. Lukin, commander of the 19th Army. The army commanders were to immediately present their breakthrough plans, report the disposition of their forces, and make requests for air support, indicating the sector where they wanted it. However, there was no reply to either of our messages. They must have reached the surrounded troops too late, when control of them was lost. Only isolated groups managed to break out of encirclement. The former commander of the 45th Cavalry Division, Stuchenko, later told me the following. What was left of our division broke out of encirclement in order to link up with the front. We engaged the Germans whenever we could afford to, killing several thousands of them. Around the middle of October, there was hardly a day without a fight, each new one more fierce than the last. Many outstanding commanders, commissars, and soldiers were killed. With deep feeling, Stuchenko told me about the heroic death of the divisional commissar A.G. Polekin, who, despite the obvious mortal danger, took personal charge of a reconnaissance party. The Germans captured him. He did not give in to threats. He said he would rather die, so they shot him. We took his body from the battlefield. His last words were, "Death is 1,000 times better than the shame of surrendering." With heavy hearts, we remembered all those who had perished in the harsh and bloody battles of October, all those who had bravely defended their motherland. They showed a fine example of patriotism, bravery, and courage, the very essence of the Soviet soldier. The Military Council of the Western Front asked the Supreme Command to shorten the front and place these troops under another command. Consequently, the Supreme Command ordered the Western Front on October 17th to detach its 22nd, 29th, and 30th Armies, which were assigned to the newly formed Kalinin Front. Col.General Konev was appointed in command of the Kalinin Front, while Corps Commissar Leonov became a member of the Military Council, and Maj.General Ivanov served as Chief of Staff. The formation of the Kalinin Front reduced the Western Front's defence zone and improved troop control. The situation on the Bryansk Front, under the command of Lt.General Yeremenko, was dire. Most troops found themselves encircled and were fighting their way east. Thanks to heroic efforts, they managed to break out of encirclement on October 23rd. In pursuit of the scattered forces of the Bryansk Front, the advance units of Guderian's army captured Orel and approached Tula on October 29th. By this time in October, apart from logistical establishments of the 50th Army, there were no troops capable of defending Tula. 3 badly damaged infantry divisions had withdrawn to the Tula area later in the month, numbering between 500 and 1,500 combatants, while an artillery regiment had only 4 guns left. The troops were battle-fatigued. The people of Tula helped tremendously, tailoring uniforms and repairing arms and combat equipment. Led by the City Party organization, they worked day and night to restore the troops' fighting capability. The Defense Committee of Tula, headed by V.G. Zhavoronkov, secretary of the Regional Party Committee, quickly organized and armed workers' detachments, which courageously fought alongside the units of the Bryansk Front's 50th Army at the city's approaches, preventing the enemy from entering. Particular staunchness and valour were displayed by the Tula Workers' Regiment, headed by Captain A.P. Gorshkov and Commissar G.A. Ageyev. This regiment took a defensive position alongside the withdrawn units near Kosaya Gora. General V.S. Popov, commander of the Tula defence area, deployed an anti-aircraft artillery regiment for use in anti-tank defence. All forces defending Tula displayed exceptional courage. Guderian counted on capturing Tula on the march and then moving on to Moscow from the south, but he failed. The offensive launched on October 30th was repulsed by the defenders of Tula, who inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. On November 10th, by decision of the Supreme Command, the Bryansk Front was disbanded, and the defence of Tula passed to the control of the Western Front. In November 1941, the enemy made repeated attempts to seize Tula and clear the way to Moscow, but failed again. The city stood as an impregnable fortress. The right flank of the enemy grouping was completely tied up. The enemy then decided to encircle Tula by a turning movement, necessitating the spread of their forces. As a result, Guderian's army lost its operational and tactical troop density. The city of Tula and its people played a crucial role in defeating the Germans at the approaches to Moscow. There is no need to recount the entire chain of events, as they have been described in detail in many works. The outcome of the defensive battles at the approaches to Moscow is also well known. In a month of heavy fighting, the enemy advanced only about 230 to 250 kilometers. However, the German command's plan to capture Moscow by mid-October was thwarted. Enemy strength was considerably sapped, and their striking forces were dissipated. The German offensive began to lose momentum as time went on. By the end of October, it was finally halted along a front line running through Turginovo, Volokolamsk, Dorokovo, Narofominsk, a point west of Serpukhov, and Alexin. The Kalinin front's defence area near Kalinin had also stabilized. It is impossible to list all the heroes who distinguished themselves during the heroic defence of Moscow in October 1941. Whole military units displayed mass heroism, not only individual soldiers, winning fame in the battles for the motherland. Such heroic units were present across every sector of the front. The Volokolamsk sector, toward which the 5th Army Corps of the enemy, later joined by 2 motorized corps, was advancing, was staunchly defended by the units of the fortified areas. The units of the newly formed 16th Army also held their ground. The 316th Rifle Division, under Maj-General IV Panfilov, fought with particular valor. A composite rifle regiment of Moscow infantry commanders' school trainees was deployed in the most crucial sector of the 16th Army, supported by 3 artillery anti-tank regiments. As the trainees were sent to their stations, the regimental commander and chief of the school, Sai Mladentsev, urged them, "The bestial enemy is thrusting towards Moscow, the heart of our country. We must stop him. We must defend our capital. And it is our duty to fight as well as our elder brothers, the Kremlin trainees, who once covered themselves with glory. This is no time to pass exams. You will pass them at the front, grappling with the enemy. I am sure that each one of you will pass these exams with honours." The regiment covered the 85 kilometres from Solnechnogorsk in double-quick time and arrived in the Volokolamsk area by nightfall on October 7th. The school commanders had made no mistake. The trainees spurned danger and death and held firmly to their defence line. Their closest neighbour was the 316th Rifle Division under General Panfilov, which earned its glory in the fighting for Moscow and was later renamed the 8th Guards Division. Due to the general shortage of manpower and materiel, battalions were extended to hold a frontage of 7 to 10 kilometres, with depths of up to 3 kilometres. There was no unbroken line of defence at Volokolamsk at the time. Only support points were manned, while the terrain between them was covered with artillery fire and, in some places, long-range machine guns. In the Mozhaisk sector, the 32nd Rifle Division under Colonel 6th Polosukin faced the enemy's 40th Motorized Corps, supported by a strong group of aircraft. Almost 130 years after the Great Patriotic War of 1812, the Borodino Field, an eternal monument to Russian military glory, again became the scene of a patriotic battle. On the Maloyaroslavets sector, units of the enemy's 12th Army and 57th Motorized Corps were advancing. Troops of the 312th Rifle Division under Colonel Naumov and cadets of the Podolsk Infantry and Artillery Schools fought valiantly at the approaches to Maloyaroslavets. The tankmen of Colonel Troitsky fought in the area of Medin, where they stood to the last. The troops of the 110th Rifle Division and the 151st Motorized Infantry Brigade distinguished themselves near the ancient Russian town of Borovsk. Shoulder to shoulder with them, the tankmen of the 127th Tank Battalion stoutly repelled enemy attacks. At great cost, the enemy managed to push our troops back to the river Protva and then to the river Nara. However, they could penetrate no farther. The 33rd Army was deployed between the 5th and 43rd Armies in the area of Narofominsk. The 43rd Army was stationed to the south of Narofominsk along the eastern bank of the Nara, while the 49th Army held positions along a line running through a point west of Serpukhov, east of Tarusa and Alexine. Having fortified their positions along the line, the troops were prepared to withstand enemy attacks. The soldiers of the Western Front learned a great deal during the 3 weeks of fighting in October. Extensive party political work was conducted among the troops, focusing on popularizing destruction of the enemy methods, as well as individual and mass heroism and combat prowess. I want to particularly emphasize the significant role played in organizing political work in the army by Division Commissar D.A. Lestev, chief of the Western Front Political Department, a fine communist and fearless soldier. On November 1st, 1941, I was summoned to General Headquarters. Stalin said to me, "Besides a ceremonial meeting, we'd like to hold a military review in Moscow on the anniversary of the October Revolution. What do you think? Will the situation on the front allow us to hold this ceremony?" I replied, "The enemy is not going to begin any major offensive in the next few days. He has suffered considerable casualties and has been forced to replace losses and regroup troops. To neutralize his aviation, which is likely to remain active, I suggest strengthening Moscow's air defense with fighter planes from the neighboring fronts." On the eve of the holiday, a ceremonial meeting for the 24th anniversary of the Great October Revolution was held in the Mayakovskaya station of the Moscow Underground, and on November 7th there was the traditional military march past in Red Square. The soldiers went to the front straight from Red Square. This event played a tremendous role in further strengthening the morale of the army and the Soviet people, and had great international importance. Stalin's speeches reiterated the party and government's confidence that the invaders would be defeated. Meanwhile, anti-tank defences were organised in depth, and tank-proof facilities were constructed in threatened areas. Losses were replaced, and arms and ammunition were supplied, along with engineering, communication, and other technical facilities and equipment. From November 1st to 15, the Western Front was reinforced with 100,000 officers and men, 300 tanks, and 2,000 guns. From these reserves, raised deep in the rear of the country, the Supreme Command strengthened the front with infantry and tank units concentrated on the more threatened sectors. Large forces were amassed in the Volokolamsk-Klin and Istra sectors, where we expected the main attack by the enemy's armour. Reserves were also brought up to the Tula-Serpukhov area, as the German 2nd Panzer and 4th Field Armies were poised to strike again. At the beginning of November, I had an uncomfortable conversation with Stalin over the phone. "What's the enemy doing?" he asked. "Completing the concentration of his striking forces. It's clear he's going to take the offensive soon," I replied. "Where do you expect his main attack?" "From the Volokolamsk area. Guderian's tank forces will evidently bypass Tula and move toward Kashira. Shaposhnikov and I believe we should forestall the enemy through counterblows. One counterblow should be delivered in the Volokolamsk area, the other from the Serpukhov area against the flank of the German 4th Army. Large forces are obviously gathering there to strike at Moscow." "With what forces, Comrade Stalin, can we deliver these counterblows?" I asked. "The Western Front cannot spare any forces. We have only troops for defence. In the Volokolamsk area, you can use the right-wing units of Rokossovsky's army, the Tank Division, and Devato's Cavalry Corps. In the Serpukhov area, you can use Bailov's Cavalry Corps, Getman's Tank Division, and some of the 49th Army units. I don't believe we can do that now. We cannot commit the front's last reserves to counterblows whose success is doubtful. We'll have nothing to strengthen our defences with when the enemy brings his main attack forces into action." "Your front has 6 armies. Do you think that's nothing?" "The Western Front is holding defences over a greatly extended frontage, which totals 600 kilometres if stretched out in a straight line. We have very small reserves in depth, especially in the central sector." "Consider the question of counterblows settled. Report your plan of operations tonight," Stalin snapped out with displeasure. About 15 minutes later, Bulganin looked in and said from the door, "Did I ever get hell?" "What for?" I asked. Stalin said, You and Zhukov have an overly high opinion of yourselves, but we'll get to you yet. He told me to see you at once and work out counterblows. All right, sit down, and let's call up Sokolovsky and inform Army Commanders Rokossovsky and Zakharkin. 2 hours later, Front HQ issued orders to the commanders of the 16th and 49th Armies and their units concerning counterblows, and we reported to General Headquarters accordingly. However, these counterblows, in which cavalry was the main force, did not yield the results that the Supreme Commander expected. The enemy was still very strong, and his pugnacity had not yet been dampened. It was only in the Alexine area that things went well. The German Fourth Army suffered heavy losses and was unable to take part in the overall advance on Moscow. To continue the thrust towards Moscow, the German command brought up more forces. By November 15th, it had in the Western Front zone 51 divisions, including 31 infantry, 13 tank and 7 motorized divisions, which were fully manned and well equipped with tanks, artillery and combat material. On the Volokholamsk-Klin and Istra sectors, the enemy had concentrated against Rokossovsky's army the 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups, consisting of 7 tank, 3 motorized and 4 infantry divisions, supported by about 2,000 artillery pieces and a powerful air group. The enemy striking force against the 50th Army on the Tula-Kashira sector comprised the 24th and 47th Motorized Corps and the 53rd and 43rd Army Corps, totaling 12 divisions, including 4 tank and 3 motorized divisions, and also having powerful air support. The German 4th Field Army, comprising 6 Army Corps, had been deployed on the Zvenigorod, Kubinka, Narofominsk, Podolsk and Serpukhov sectors. Through frontal attacks, this army was to pin down the troops of the Western Front, sap them of their strength, and then strike a blow in the central sector towards Moscow. The second stage of the Moscow offensive began on November 15th with an attack against the 30th Army of the Kalinin Front, which had weak defences south of the Volga Reservoir. Simultaneously, the enemy struck against the troops of the Western Front, specifically against the right flank of the 16th Army south of the river Shosha. A secondary attack was also launched in the zone of that army in the area of Teryaeva-Sloboda. The defences of the 30th Army were soon pierced by the enemy's 300 tanks, while our troops had only 56 light tanks with little firepower. The defence was not able to hold out and was soon broken. On the morning of November 16th, the enemy began stepping up his attack from the Volokholamsk area towards Klin. We did not have sufficient reserves in that sector since they had been moved, on orders from GHQ, to the Volokholamsk area to mount a counterblow, and were subsequently pinned down by the enemy. That day, the enemy struck a powerful blow in the area of Volokholamsk. 2 enemy tank and 2 enemy infantry divisions advanced in the direction of Istra. On the Istra sector, the enemy had concentrated 400 medium tanks against our 150 light tanks. Fierce fighting ensued. The 316th Rifle Division under General Panfilov, the 78th Rifle Division under Colonel Beloborodov, the 18th Rifle Division under General Chernyshev, Mladentsev's detached cadet regiment, the 1st Guards, the 23rd, 27th and 28th detached tank brigades, and Maj.General Dovata's cavalry group put up especially stiff resistance. At 23 o'clock HRS on November 17th, the 30th Army of the Kalinin Front passed by the Supreme Command order to the control of the Western Front. This further extended the front's positions to the north, up to the Volga Reservoir. Maj.General Lelyushenko was put in command of the 30th Army. From November the 16th through 18, our troops had some very gruelling engagements. Paying no attention to his losses, the enemy repeatedly attacked our positions, trying at all costs to break through to Moscow with his tank spearheads. However, the depth of our artillery and anti-tank defences, as well as excellent cooperation between all fighting forces, prevented the enemy from penetrating the defence lines of the 16th Army. It would deliberately and gradually withdraw from action and retire to positions held by our artillery, where it would offer resistance again, repulsing the fierce attacks of the Nazi troops. Exceptional gallantry was displayed by the 1st Guards Tank Brigade of the 16th Army. In October, this unit, then the 4th Tank Brigade, had fought heroically near Orel and Mtsensk, for which it was honoured with the title of 1st Guards Tank Brigade. Now, in November, its men enhanced their unit's brilliant combat reputation by courageously defending the approaches to Moscow. The State Committee for Defence, and part of the leadership of the Party Central Committee and of the Council of People's Commissars, were working in Moscow as usual. Moscow workers toiled from 12 to 18 hours a day, providing the fronts that covered the approaches to Moscow with arms, ammunition, and equipment. The capital was still in danger. The enemy, albeit slowly, was advancing towards Moscow. I don't remember exactly what day it was, but it was certainly soon after the German tactical breakthrough in the 30th Army sector of the Kalinin front. Stalin phoned me and asked, "Are you sure we'll be able to hold Moscow? It hurts me to ask you this. Answer me truthfully as a communist." "We'll definitely hold Moscow, but we'll need at least 2 more armies and another 200 tanks." "It's good that you are so confident. Call the General Staff and make arrangements for the assignment of the 2 reserve armies you are asking for. They will be ready by late November. Right now, we can't get you any tanks yet." Half an hour later, Vasilevsky and I agreed that the 1st Shock Army and the 10th Army would be sent to the Western Front, where they would join the 20th Army. The 1st Shock Army would be assigned to the Yakroma area, and the 10th Army to the Ryazan area. The enemy initiated the offensive in the Moscow-Tula zone of operations on November 18th. His 3rd, 4th and 17th Panzer Divisions began thrusting forward in the Venev area, where the defence was being conducted by the 413th and 299th Rifle Divisions of the 50th Army. That group penetrated our defences and captured the area of Bolokovo and Dedilovo. The 239th Rifle and the 41st Cavalry Divisions were hastily deployed to counter the enemy in the area of Uzlovaya. Our troops displayed mass heroism in the fierce fighting that lasted day and night. The units of the 413th Rifle Division fought with particular gallantry. On November 21st, the main force of Guderian's Panzer Army captured Uzlovaya and Stalinogorsk. The enemy's 47th Motorized Corps was advancing in the direction of Mikhailov. The consequence was that a rather complicated situation developed in the area of Tula. In these circumstances, the Military Council of the Front decided to bolster the Kashira defence area with the 112th Armoured Division under Colonel, now General of the Army, Getman. The Ryazan defence area was to be strengthened with a tank brigade and other units. The Zaraysk sector with the 9th Tank Brigade and the 35th and 127th Detached Tank Battalions, and the Laptevo sector with the 510th Rifle Regiment and a tank company. On November 26th, the enemy's 3rd Panzer Division pressed our units back and straddled the railway line and the Tula-Moscow highway at a point north of Tula. However, the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps under General P.A. Belov, the 112th Tank Division, and several other units repulsed the enemy's attacks in the area of Kashira and halted the enemy. The 173rd Rifle Division and the 15th Guards Mortar Regiment were sent to the Kashira area as reinforcements for the units fighting there. On November 27th, Belov's Cavalry Corps, coordinating operations with the 112th Tank Division, the 173rd Rifle Division and other units, struck a counterblow at Guderian's troops and drove them 10-15 kilometres back south towards Venev. Up to November 30th, gruelling battles were fought in the areas of Kashira and Mordves, but the enemy was not successful. Guderian began feeling certain that it was impossible to break down the stubborn resistance of our troops in the area of Kashira and Tula and to smash through to Moscow. The Nazi troops were forced to assume the defensive in that sector. The Soviet troops fighting in this sector repulsed all attacks by the enemy, inflicted heavy losses, and did not let him break through to Moscow. Things were not so bright, however, on the right flank of the front in the area of Istra, Klin and Solnekhnogorsk, where the 16th Army was putting up stubborn resistance. On November 23rd, enemy tanks burst into Klin. To avoid encirclement, the 16th Army had to withdraw in the early hours of the 24th to the next rear line. Following heavy engagements, the 16th Army retreated from Klin. The loss of Klin created a gap between the 16th Army and the 49th Army of the Western Front, while the right flank of the 49th Army was being pressed by enemy forces at Solnechnogorsk and to the north. The fate of Moscow was decided in these days, but the situation continued to be grim. The enemy was moving ahead, having succeeded in concentrating a powerful force against the 49th Army. That evening, I reported the current situation to the Supreme Command and informed them about our decision to switch the 49th Army to a defensive operation and to bring up reserves from the western regions. We had still hoped to hold the 49th Army's positions and organised defence on the borders of the Moscow region. However, the German troops managed to concentrate their forces, inflicting heavy losses on our defenders in the Tula region, and in that situation we had to call the 50th Army to Moscow. On November 29th, the enemy launched another attack against the 49th Army at Tula. Despite heavy losses, the enemy managed to break through our defences in the area of Tula and advanced toward the capital. The 49th Army's defences collapsed, and by the evening of December 1st, the enemy entered the outskirts of Tula, having concentrated 6 panzer divisions, including the 1st, 2nd, 5th and 6th Panzer Divisions, and the 17th Motorized Corps, against our remaining positions. The enemy had gathered such great strength against the 49th Army that the commander of the 49th Army, General Ruski, sent a report to the Supreme Command indicating the need to withdraw the troops from Tula. On December 2nd, I ordered the military units at Tula to withdraw towards Moscow. The 50th Army moved to the Volga Highway. However, the situation remained extremely complicated. The 16th Army had its own artillery officer, Maj.General 6 Kazakov, and besides, the commanding general knew best what to do and how to do it. So why should he, Govorov, leave his army at a frenzied time like this? To avoid further discussion, I had to tell the general that those were Stalin's orders. On the way to Beloborodov's division, we called for Rokossovsky. The division commander was not especially overjoyed to see us in his perimeter. He was up to his neck in detail as it was, and here he had to make explanations concerning a few houses across the gully in the village of Dedovo that had been seized by the enemy. Reporting the situation, General Beloborodov showed us convincingly that recapturing those houses was tactically inexpedient. Unfortunately, I could not tell him that in that particular case I was not guided by tactical considerations, and so I ordered him to send a rifle company with 2 tanks to dislodge the German squad holding the houses. But let us turn back to serious things. On December 1st, the German forces unexpectedly effected a breakthrough in the central sector at the junction between the 5th and 33rd Armies and began advancing along the highway towards Kubinka. However, they were halted near the village of Akulovo by the 32nd Rifle Division, whose artillery destroyed some of their tanks. Many more enemy tanks were blown up on minefields. Reeling back with heavy losses, the German armoured units turned to Golitsino, where they were utterly routed by the front reserve forces and units of the 5th and 33rd Armies. The breakthrough was ultimately halted on December 4th, the enemy leaving on the battlefield over 10,000 dead, 50 tanks, and a great deal of other combat materiel destroyed. From the nature of operations and the strength of attacks of all the enemy groupings, it became obvious by the end of November that the Germans were losing strength and had neither the manpower nor the weapons to continue the offensive. Having deployed his striking forces over an extended frontage and made a wide swing with his armoured fist, the enemy had, in the course of the battles near Moscow, spread out his troops so thin that they lost their ramming ability in the final engagements at the near approaches to Moscow. The Nazi command had not expected their losses to be as great as those sustained by its troops in the Battle of Moscow. Moreover, it was unable to replace those losses and reinforce its Moscow grouping. Interrogation of prisoners revealed that some companies had only 20, 30 men left, that the morale of the German troops had greatly deteriorated, and that they no longer believed that it was possible to capture Moscow. The troops of the Western Front had also suffered heavily and were totally battle-fatigued, but held on to their defences, and reinforced by reserves, they fought the enemy with renewed strength. In the 20 days of the second stage of their Moscow campaign, German casualties were over 155,000 killed and wounded. They lost about 800 tanks, hundreds of artillery pieces, and a great number of planes. The heavy losses and the unfulfilled strategic tasks sowed the seeds of doubt in the German soldiers' minds that they would win the war. In the eyes of people around the world, the Nazi military and political leadership lost its reputation for invincibility. Former Nazi generals and field marshals have tried to blame Hitler for the failure of the plan to capture Moscow and of the entire Eastern campaign. Hitler, they say, did not heed their advice and slowed down the advance of the Army Group Center on Moscow in August by diverting part of the forces to the Ukraine. General Mellenthin, for instance, writes, "The drive on Moscow, which was favored by Guderian and temporarily abandoned in August in favor of the conquest of the Ukraine, might have yielded decisive results if it had been ruthlessly pursued as the dominating Schwerpunkt of the invasion. Russia might have been paralyzed by a thrust at the heart of Stalin's power. Generals Guderian, Hoth, and others consider the severe Russian climate, coupled with Hitler's miscalculations, to be the main reason for their defeat near Moscow. Of course, weather and climate play a definite role in any combat action, and equally affect the combatants on both sides. It is true that Nazi soldiers wrapped themselves up in clothes seized from the population and walked about shod in unsightly homemade straw galoshes. Warm clothes and uniforms are also a weapon. Our country fed and clothed her soldiers. But the Nazi army was not prepared for the winter. The German leaders believed the Russian campaign would be little short of a walkover, taking just months or weeks. Obviously, the Nazi ringleaders grossly miscalculated politically and strategically, and not simply with the climate. Other generals and bourgeois historians put all the blame on mud and lack of roads. There is nothing new about this version either. Napoleon, who lost his army of 800,000, also blamed the Russian winter. But I was there to see thousands upon thousands of Moscow women, not particularly suited for the arduous job of sapping, who had left their comfortable homes to dig anti-tank ditches and trenches, put up barricades, construct asparagus and other obstacles, and carry sandbags. Mud stuck to their feet and to the wheels of the barrows in which they carried earth. Mud stuck to the blades of the spades, making them unwieldy in feminine hands. For the benefit of those who are inclined to hide behind the mud as the real reason for the Germans' defeat near Moscow, I would like to add that the period of slush in October 1941 was comparatively short. Cold weather set in and snow fell in early November, making the terrain and roads passable everywhere. At the time of the all-out German offensive in November, the temperature in the Moscow area was from 7 degrees to 10 degrees below zero, which, as one can well imagine, means there was no slush. No. It was neither rain nor snow that stopped the fascist troops near Moscow. The grouping of picked Nazi troops, over 1 million strong, was routed by the courage, iron staunchness, and valour of the Soviet troops who had the people, Moscow, and their country behind them. As for the temporary suspension of the Moscow offensive and the diversion of part of the forces to the Ukraine, we may assume that without that operation the situation of the German central grouping might have been even worse than it turned out to be. For the Supreme Command reserves, which were used to fill the gaps in the southwestern sector in September, could have been used to strike at the flank and the rear of the Army Group Center which was advancing on Moscow. Enraged by the failure of the second stage of the advance on Moscow and of the Blitzkrieg plan, and looking for scapegoats, Hitler relieved of command Field Marshal General Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Land Forces, Field Marshal General von Bock, Commander of the Army Group Center, General Guderian, Commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, and many other generals on whom he had lavishly bestowed Knight's Crosses and other high awards just 1.5 to 2 months before. Hitler appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the Land Forces, apparently believing that this would have a magic effect on the troops. On December 11, 1941, the Hitler government declared war against the United States. By this act, Hitler evidently wanted to accomplish 2 things. First, he wanted to show that Germany, ignoring her losses, was becoming even stronger and was capable of carrying on the war not only against the Soviet Union and Britain, but against the United States as well. Second, he wanted to quickly push Japan into action against the USA in order to ensure that the United States would not be involved in the war against Germany in Europe. When Stalin heard the news, he smiled ironically. Interesting. What forces and what resources can Germany use in fighting against the United States? For this kind of war, she has neither long-distance air strength nor appropriate naval strength. I was often asked how it was that the Soviet troops managed to defeat the powerful German groupings near Moscow, and in conditions of severe winter drive what remained of them back west. The Germans' defeat near Moscow has been described by many authors, and on the whole correctly. However, I, as former commander of the Western Front, would like to give my own view of that battle. As is known, when Operation Typhoon began on the Moscow sector, the German command planned to rout the Soviet forces in the Vyazma-Moscow and the Bryansk-Moscow sectors, and outflank Moscow to the north and south, so they could seize the city as soon as possible. The enemy intended to achieve that strategic aim in 2 consecutive stages by double envelopment. During the first, he planned to envelop and rout our troops in the area of Bryansk and Vyazma, while during the second, he intended to envelop and capture Moscow by skirting it with the armoured units from the northwest via Klin and Kalinin, and from the south via Tula and Kashira, completing the strategic pincer movement in the area of Noginsk. However, when they were preparing this very complex operation, the German command woefully miscalculated in estimating the necessary manpower and materiel. It had seriously underrated the capabilities of the Red Army and overrated those of its own troops. The forces concentrated by the German command carried only enough punch to break through our defence line at Vyazma and Bryansk, and to press back the forces of the Western and Kalinin fronts to a line running through Kalinin, Yakroma, Krasnaya Polyana, Kryukovo, the rivers Nara and Oka. But even that was only partially achieved due to the fierce resistance of our troops, who, despite the disorganization brought about by a surprise and sudden attack, fought bravely and heroically. And this was a real feat considering the full impact of a swift offensive operation, with enemy units 10 times larger than our own. Our troops, in turn, had to reckon with the great numbers of enemy troops that were thrown into the battles and the superior firepower of the attacking forces. In the first month of the offensive, the enemy engaged 80% of the armoured divisions, half of the motorised divisions, and a large number of artillery divisions. The Germans mobilised all the reserves they could in the central sector and used up a considerable amount of their strength there. Under such circumstances, we were forced to put our troops into battle with their backs against the wall, defending every inch of Soviet soil, with our entire forces deployed in a deep and protracted defence. Our front had initially been set up in a line running from the northwest to the southeast. However, a considerable portion of our defensive installations had been built before the war. The enemy was well aware of the weak points in our defence. The Western Front was to be supported by reserves. Therefore, the idea was to stop the enemy in the area of the Kalinin Front and to gain time until new reserves could be brought up. The order was given for our divisions to hold on until reinforcements could arrive and to retake the initiative after that. It was a key moment in our military operation. In a desperate situation, we managed to hold on to our positions and stop the enemy advance. Fighting with all our might and spirit, we managed to gain time, and from that moment on we launched a counteroffensive. Thanks to the initiative and courage of our troops, the situation was salvaged. The enemy's 2 armoured divisions were totally encircled and routed near Vyazma, and by December we had regained control over the entire territory of the Western Front. The road to Moscow had been barred. Moscow had been saved. We submitted our ideas, which were graphically put down on a map, for no details were required since we had agreed on all the basics in advance with Stalin, Shaposhnikov and Vasilevsky. I merely attached a short note to Vasilevsky. Please urgently let People's Commissar of Defence Comrade Stalin have the Western Front's plan of the counteroffensive and issue a directive that we may launch the operation, for otherwise we might miss the bus. A note attached to the map showed that, owing to the situation, the armies of the front could not simultaneously go on the counter-offensive. We set the following schedule. 1. Considering the detrainment and concentration of troops and their rearming, the time the attack is to begin shall be between the morning of the 3rd and the 4th of December for the first shock, the 20th, the 16th and Golikov's armies, and between the 5th and 6th of December for the 30th Army. In the next clause of the note, we explained that the armies we were committing in the offensive were listed in the Stavka's directive and described the objectives of the Western Front. The immediate objective is to strike at Klin and Solnechnogorsk and thrust in the direction of the Istra, crushing the main enemy group on the right flank, and to strike at Uzlovaya and Bogoroditsk, hitting the flank and rear of the Guderian group, thus smashing the enemy on the left flank of the Western Front armies. To pin down enemy forces along the rest of the front and deny the enemy any chance of rushing in troops, the Western Front's 5th, 33rd, 43rd, 49th and 50th armies shall assume the offensive with limited objectives on the 4-5th of December. The main air group, 3/4 of all aircraft, shall cooperate with the shock group on the right, while the rest shall cooperate with Lieutenant General Golikov's army on the left. Stalin wrote, "I agree on the plan," and signed it. The objectives set for the individual armies of the Western Front were: the First Shock Army under the command of General Kuznetsov was to deploy for attack in the area of Dmitrov and Yakroma, and, in cooperation with the 30th and 20th armies, strike towards Klein and then advance in the general direction of Teryaeva-Sloboda. The 20th Army, in cooperation with the First Shock and the 16th Armies, was to launch an attack from the Krasnaya, Polyana and Bely Rast area in the general direction of Solnechnogorsk, enveloping it from the south, and then advance on Volokolamsk. The right wing of the 16th Army was to thrust towards Kryukovo and then develop the attack depending on the situation. The 10th Army, in cooperation with the units of the 50th Army, was to launch an attack in the direction of Stalinogorsk-Bogoroditsk and further on to the south of the river Upa. Under the counter-offensive plan, the initial task for the troops on the flanks of the Western Front was to smash up the striking forces of Army Group Centre, thus removing the immediate threat to Moscow. We would need more forces to assign farther-going and more categorical missions. As it was, our purpose was to throw the enemy as far away from Moscow as we could, causing him maximum casualties. Although the Western Front had been given 3 more armies, this had given us no numerical superiority over the enemy, except in aircraft. He still had more tanks and artillery. This circumstance determined the plan of the counter-offensive. In the early morning of December 1st, 1941, having made a thorough study of the battles fought by the Kalinin Front and their results, the Supreme Command came to the conclusion that its method of separate attacks in different directions, as witnessed on November 27 through 29, was ineffective in the given circumstances. The Stavka ordered the Kalinin Front to concentrate a shock force of not less than 5 or 6 divisions within the next 2 or 3 days, and strike out at Turgenovo in order to emerge in the rear of the enemy's group in Klin, and thus assist the troops of the Western Front in wiping it out. General Konev, who was in command of the Kalinin Front, reported to the Stavka that he could not carry out its order because he lacked strength and had no tanks. Instead of the powerful blow in depth planned by the Supreme Command, he suggested a separate bid to capture Kalinin. The Stavka objected, noting that the proposal of the Kalinin Front commander ran counter to the common aim of launching a resolute counter-offensive at Moscow. Stalin instructed the Deputy Chief of General Staff, General Vasilevsky, who had also attached his signature to the directive that required the Kalinin Front to form a shock force, to have a talk with General Konev to explain his mistake and the substance of the case. Vasilevsky coped with his mission splendidly. He had a thorough knowledge of the situation of the front, knew its strength and potential, and telegraphed the following to Konev on December 1st. Nothing but active operations with a decisive objective can botch the German offensive on Moscow, and thereby not only save Moscow, but also lay the foundation for seriously defeating the enemy. If we do not accomplish this within the next few days, it will be too late. The Kalinin front holds an exceedingly advantageous operational position for this purpose and must not look on idly. It is your duty to gather literally everything in order to hit the enemy who is weak in your sector. Believe me, success is certain." Thereupon, Vasilevsky made a detailed study of the front, named the divisions he thought should be used, and said how to reinforce them with guns from the front's own artillery. "Literally every hour counts," he concluded, "and you must therefore do everything you can to launch the operation not later than the morning of the 4th. The front commander could only admit that the Stavka had been right and assure the Supreme Command that he would gather all needed strength for the strike. "I'm taking a risk," Konev remarked, however, in conclusion. Late on December 4th, the Supreme Commander called me up and asked, "Aside from what has already been done, how else can we help the front?" I replied that air support was necessary from the Supreme Command Reserve and the National Air Defence Forces. Besides, we needed at least 200 manned tanks. The front had an insignificant number of tanks, and without armour we could not rapidly step up the counteroffensive. "We can give you no tanks," Stalin said, "but you will have aircraft. Talk it over with the General Staff. I'll phone there now. Don't forget that the Kalinin front assumes the offensive on December 5th, and the task force on the right wing of the southwestern front does the same on December 6th, in the area of Yelets." The General Staff clarified the following. Troops of the Kalinin front were being engaged to assist the counter-offensive of the Western Front. Their objective was to strike in a southwesterly direction and emerge in the rear of the enemy group at Klin and Solnekhnogorsk, thus contributing to its final defeat by the troops of the Western Front. The Southwestern Front's thrust against the enemy in Yelets was to assist the Western Front in crushing the enemy troops southwest of Moscow. Deep snow greatly hampered the concentration and regrouping of troops and their movement to assault positions. However, the troops overcame these difficulties, and by the morning of December 6th were ready to launch the counter-offensive. On December 6, 1941, the troops of the Western Front began their counter-offensive to the north and south of Moscow. The neighbouring fronts moved forward in the area of Kalinin and Yelets. A large-scale battle developed. On the first day of the offensive, the forces of the Kalinin front penetrated the forward line of defence but could not topple the enemy. It was only after 10 days of bitter fighting and changing of tactics of the offensive that our troops began pushing forward. They were facilitated by the right wing of the Western Front, which had smashed up the enemy grouping in the Rogachevo-Solnekhnogorsk area and turned Klin. On December 13th, the 30th Army, commanded by Lelyushenko and some of the units of the 1st Shock Army of the Western Front, approached Klin. Having enveloped the city on all sides, the Soviet troops burst into Klin and, after fierce battles, liberated it in the small hours of December 15th. The 20th and 16th Armies' offensive was also gathering momentum. Towards the end of the day on December 9th, the 20th Army, having broken down the enemy's stubborn resistance, approached Solnekhnogorsk. The enemy was dislodged from that city on December 12th. Meanwhile, the 16th Army liberated Kryukovo on December 8th and began stepping up the offensive towards the Istra Reservoir. The right-wing units of the 5th Army under General Govorov were advancing as well. The 5th Army's advance largely contributed to the success of the 16th Army. After Klin was liberated, British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden came there on a visit. At the end of December, we saw in the Pravda Eden's statement made on his return to London. Speaking of the impressions of his visit to the Soviet Union, he remarked that the Soviet people had withstood the attack and were now fighting back. "I'm for strengthening the Western theatre and stepping up the offensive there," Voznesensky observed. "We don't have the means to ensure simultaneous offensive operations on all the fronts now," Stalin said. "I have spoken to Timoshenko. He is for the offensive in the southwestern direction. We have to pound the Germans to pieces as soon as possible so that they won't be able to mount an offensive in spring. Who else would like to speak?" There was no reply. The discussion of Stalin's suggestions was thus left up in the air. As we left the conference room, Shaposhnikov said to me, "You shouldn't have argued. The Supreme Commander had that question settled." "Why was our opinion asked then?" "That, my dear fellow, I do not know," Shaposhnikov said, sighing heavily. Front headquarters received the letter of instructions for the offensive on January 7, 1942. In compliance with these instructions, the Military Council assigned the front's forces additional tasks to continue the counteroffensive. The right flank of the front, the 1st Shock, 20th and 16th Armies, were to continue advancing in the general direction of Sikievka and, in cooperation with the Kalinin front, to rout the Sikievka-Rzhev enemy grouping. The centre forces of the front, the 5th and 33rd Armies, were to advance in the general direction of Mozhaisk-Gzhatsk. The job of the 43rd, 49th and 50th Armies was to strike towards Yukhnov, rout the Yukhnov-Kondrov enemy grouping, and exploit the success towards Vyazma. The reinforced cavalry corps under General Belov was to move out to the Vyazma area and link up with the Kalinin Front's 11th Cavalry Corps under General Sokolov for a combined blow against the rear of the Vyazma enemy grouping. At that time, large partisan detachments were active in the Vyazma area. The 10th Army's mission was to advance on Kirov, protecting the front's left flank. Our neighbour on the right, the Kalinin Front, as we already pointed out, was to advance in the general direction of Sikievka-Vyazma, circumventing Rzhev, with its 22nd Army stepping up the offensive towards Bely. The northwestern front had to mount an offensive in two diverging directions. Its 3rd Shock Army under General Pukayev was to advance in the general direction of Velikiye Luki, while its 4th Shock Army under General Yeremenko was to press towards Toropets and Velizh. The right flank armies of the southwestern and Bryansk fronts were to contain the enemy, preventing him from transferring forces to his central zone of action and the Donbas area. The forces in the southwestern zone of advance were to capture Kharkov and seize bridgeheads near Dnepropetrovsk and Zaporozhye. It was an imposing plan, but in several directions, especially the main direction, west, it was not backed up with sufficient manpower or weapons. This the Supreme Commander knew perfectly well, but he believed that even the available strength was enough to crush the Nazi defences if we followed the principle of amassing shock forces and conducting our artillery offensives skillfully. On January 10th, commanders of fronts and armies received a Supreme Command directive which contained an assessment of the war situation in the spirit of Stalin's utterances at the aforementioned meeting of January 5, 1942, and instructed the fronts to operate with shock forces and to organise artillery offensives. Let me cite the more important passages of the said directive. To secure successes in 1942, our troops must learn to break through the enemy's defence line, to organise the breaches to its entire depth, and thus open the way for our infantry, our tanks, our cavalry. The Germans have more than one defence line. They are building and will soon have a second and a third. If our troops do not learn to breach and crash through the enemy's defence line swiftly and substantially, our advance will become impossible. Then the directive set forth two conditions that Stalin thought had to be carried out if we wanted to succeed. The first was actions by shock forces. Our troops usually advance as separate divisions or brigades deployed along the front in a chain. This organisation of an offensive cannot be effective, of course, because it gives us no edge in strength at some particular place. Such an offensive is doomed to failure. An offensive can be effective only if we concentrate a considerably superior force vis-à-vis the enemy in one of the sectors of the front. It is essential for this that each army setting out to breach the enemy's defence should have a shock force of 3 or 4 divisions massed for a strike at some specific point along the front. That, indeed, is the prime task of the Army Command, because that is the only way to gain a decisive edge in strength and secure success in breaching the enemy's defence at some definite sector of the front. This was followed by the second instruction concerning artillery offensives. Often, the directive said, we send the infantry into an attack against the enemy's defence line without artillery, without any artillery support whatsoever, and after that we complain that the infantry won't rise against an enemy who has dug in and is defending himself. It is clear, however, that such an offensive cannot yield the desired effect. It is not an offensive, but a crime against the motherland and against the troops which are forced to suffer senseless losses. This means, first, that the artillery must not confine itself to separate actions for an hour or two before an offensive, and that it must advance together with the infantry and must sustain the shelling all through the offensive with just short breaks until the enemy's defence line is broken up to its entire depth. This means, second, that the infantry must not wait until after the shelling to attack, as this occurs following the so-called artillery preparation, and that it must attack together with the artillery, to the thunder of gunfire, to the tune of the artillery. This means, third, that the artillery should not fire at random, but massively, and not massively at any point of the front, but in the zone of the shock force of the army or front, and exclusively in that zone, because otherwise the artillery offensive is inconceivable. The instructions contained in the Stavka Directive were adopted for unconditional fulfillment. I take the liberty of saying once more, however, that in the winter of 1942 we did not have the requisite strength and weaponry to put these ideas of a broad offensive, which were in general correct, into effect. And lacking such strength, the troops could not form the desired shock forces and carry out artillery offensives effectively enough to crush so powerful and proficient an enemy as the Nazi Wehrmacht, and the events bore this out. The advance of the northwestern front was the only one that developed well, because here the enemy had no unbroken line of defence. In early February 1942, the 3rd and 4th Shock Armies of this front, having covered about 250 kilometres, moved up to Velikiye Luki, Demidov and Velizh. The Kalinin Front's 22nd Army was then fighting for the town of Bely, while the 11th Cavalry Corps was moving out to an area northwest of Vyazma. The Kalinin Front's 39th and 29th Armies were pushing forward slowly west of Rzhev. Faced by a well-organised defence system, the left flank troops of the Kalinin Front were unable to obtain any success. The enemy's actions at that time were determined by Hitler's order of January 3, 1942, which said in part, "We must cling to every town and village, retreating not a step, fighting to the last cartridge, to the last grenade. That is what the present situation demands." "Herren commanders," went an order from the commander of the 23rd Infantry Division, "the general combat situation urgently demands that the rapid withdrawal of our troops be stopped on the River Lama line and that the division organise firm resistance. Positions along the Lama must be held to the last man. It is a question of life and death." What prompted the German command to call on its troops peremptorily to stop and take a stand on the Lama line? It proceeded from the fact that there were defensive positions that our troops had organised back in October and November, where the enemy could temporarily consolidate his hold. These positions ran north to south along both banks of the Lama, linking with positions on the rivers Ruza and Nara. Besides, by bringing from the deep rear all sorts of composite and reserve divisions, as well as units freshly drawn off from occupied territory, the enemy managed by mid-December to further develop the positions for defence. Organisation of the ground was completed by the time the retreating German troops reached the line along the said rivers. Permit me to briefly recall to the reader the Soviet offensive near Moscow at the beginning of 1942. On January 10, 1942, following a 90-minute artillery preparation, our Western Front's forces, the 20th Army, part of the 1st Shock Army, the 2nd Cavalry Corps under Maj-General I.A. Plyev, the 22nd Tank Brigade and 5 ski battalions, launched an attack to penetrate the front line in the area of Volokholamsk. After 2 days of fighting, the troops broke through the enemy's defence. It was at this time that I began to receive detailed reports on the situation. They noted that the forward companies of the infantry and cavalry had advanced 3-5 kilometres beyond the enemy's defence, taking a large number of prisoners and seizing military equipment. But the offensive was stopped short of 3 kilometres from the town of Volokholamsk due to the lack of reserves and reinforcing units. The situation was aggravated by the counterattacks launched by the enemy with artillery and aviation support. On January 11th, I received a report from a brigade commander stating that his brigade had reached Volokholamsk and was prepared to enter the town, but that further advance was impossible due to heavy enemy fire. In vain, I tried to convince him that it was impossible to stop the advance at that time. On the 12th, we received reports that the troops were still able to capture towns and settlements, including some prisoners of war. As events showed, however, the Soviet troops did not have enough forces to develop their offensive in a timely manner. The events in January and early February indicated that while the Soviet troops had considerable success, the enemy was steadily regrouping forces, consolidating its positions, and organizing their defense. The time from January 20th through February 5th, 1942, is when a critical moment in the course of the Second World War occurred, as the German troops prepared for the next offensive against Moscow in the spring of 1942. During this time, the Soviet troops had to slow down their advance, holding the captured settlements in defense. Our troops were forced to regroup forces to continue their offensive. To help out General Yefremov's force, Belov's cavalry corps, committed on the Vyazma sector, had moved out to the neighbourhood of Vyazma and linked up with Yefremov's troops, with the result that they themselves became cut off from the rear. By that time, the German command had brought large reserves to the Vyazma area from France and from other fronts, and had managed to stabilize the situation. Hard as we tried, we were unable to pierce the enemy's defences. The result was that we had to leave that entire grouping in the enemy rear in a wooded area southwest of Vyazma, where many partisan detachments had their bases. Finding itself in the enemy's rear for 2 months, Belov's corps, Yefremov's group, and the airborne units joined with the partisans to harass the enemy, destroying his manpower and materiel. On February 10th, the 8th Airborne Brigade and partisan detachments raided the headquarters of the German 5th Panzer Division, capturing a considerable amount of equipment, and occupied the area of Morshanovo-Diaghilevo. That same day, General Belov and Yefremov were informed of it, and ordered to coordinate their actions with the commander of the 8th Airborne Brigade, whose headquarters was in Diaghilevo. Having established radio contact with Belov and Yefremov, the front command organized, as far as it was possible, the air supply of ammunition, medicines, and provisions. Many of the wounded were airlifted to the rear. General V.S. Golushkevich, chief of the Front Headquarters Operations Division, and liaison officers made several flights to the grouping. At the beginning of April, the grouping's position became seriously worse. Having built up considerable strength, the enemy increased pressure on the grouping, aiming to eliminate this dangerous splinter by spring. A thaw at the end of April almost totally robbed the grouping of its possibility to maneuver, as well as of its communication with the partisan-controlled area from which it received provisions and fodder. At the request of Generals Belov and Yefremov, the front command gave them permission to begin leading out their troops so they could link up with the main forces. The grouping was given strict orders to leave the Vyazma area through partisan-held forests, moving in the general direction of Kirov, where the 10th Army was preparing to break through the enemy's defence, which was weaker in that sector. General Belov's cavalry corps and the airborne units followed these instructions to the letter, and after passing along a long U-shaped route, reached the area of the 10th Army on July 18, 1942. Skillfully skirting around large enemy groupings and destroying small ones in its way, most of the party emerged through a breach created by the 10th Army into the front line. It had lost many of its heavy weapons and combat materiel during the operation in the enemy rear and on the way out. Yet the majority of the men did reach our troops. How joyous was the meeting between the men who had broken out of the enemy rear and those who had backed up their manoeuvre. Neither the officers nor the men were ashamed of their tears, as they were tears of happiness and comradeship in arms. However, the route was difficult, and unfortunately not everyone managed it. General Yefremov considered the route too long for his worn-out troops, and directly radioed the general staff, asking for permission to effect a breakthrough along the shortest route, across the Ugra. Immediately after, Stalin called me and asked whether I approved Yefremov's suggestion. I replied that I emphatically did not. However, the Supreme Commander said that General Yefremov was an experienced army commander and that we should accede to his request. The Supreme Command ordered a counterattack by the forces of the front. This attack was prepared and carried out by the 43rd Army. However, no counterattack came from General Yefremov's troops. We later learned that the Germans had spotted General Yefremov's force en route to the Ugra and destroyed it. Fighting a losing battle, Army Commander General Yefremov, who fought with great gallantry, was seriously wounded. To escape being taken prisoner, Yefremov shot himself. This was the tragic death of that valiant military leader. Most of his heroic men fell alongside him. Lt. General Yefremov assumed command of the 33rd Army on October 25, 1941, when the Germans were thrusting towards Moscow. In the Battle of Moscow, his troops fought valiantly and did not let the enemy break through their lines. For valour displayed in the Battle of Moscow, General Yefremov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Army Artillery Commander Maj.General P.N. Afrosimov, a remarkable man and an extremely capable artillery officer, and some other commanders and political workers who had distinguished themselves in the Battle of Moscow, fell in the same fighting in which General Yefremov died. Viewing the events of 1942 critically, I can say now that we misjudged the situation in the Vyazma area. We had overrated the potential of our troops and underrated the enemy. He proved to be a harder nut to crack than we believed. In February and March, the Supreme Command demanded that the offensive in the western zone of operations be stepped up, but the fronts had neither the manpower nor the equipment for this to be done. The country's entire resources were strained to the utmost at the time. It was not able to satisfy the requirements of the armed forces, which the situation and current tasks demanded. Things came to such a point that every time we were summoned to General Headquarters, we took the opportunity to coax out of the Supreme Commander at least 15 anti-tank rifles, anti-tank guns, submachine guns, or what was to us the bare minimum of mortar and artillery shells. Whatever we could obtain in this way was immediately loaded onto trucks and sent to the armies that most needed it. Ammunition was especially in short supply. Of the total ammunition supplies planned for the first 10 days of January, the front in fact received 1% of the 82mm mortar shells and 30% of the artillery rounds. For January as a whole, the percentages were 50mm mortar shells, 2.7%, 82mm mortar shells, 55%, 120mm mortar shells, 36%, artillery rounds, 44%. Things were even worse in February. Of the 316 carloads of ammunition scheduled for the first 10 days of the month, none arrived. Because of the shortage of ammunition, some of the rocket artillery had to be sent to the rear. Believe it or not, the normal rate of ammunition expenditure we had to establish was 1 to 2 rounds per artillery piece per day, and that during an offensive campaign. The Front Command's report to the Supreme Commander on February 14, 1942, stated, "Combat experience has shown that the shortage of ammunition is preventing us from launching artillery attacks. As a result, enemy fire systems are not being disrupted, while our units, attacking insufficiently neutralized enemy defenses, are suffering heavily without scoring the expected successes." In late February and early March of 1942, the Supreme Command decided to bolster the fronts on the western sector with manpower and materiel. However, the decision was taken too late. Worried by the turn of events, the enemy had greatly strengthened his Vyazma grouping and, using his well-organized positions as support, began active operations against the western and Kalinin fronts. It was becoming more and more difficult for our worn-out and depleted troops to overcome the enemy's resistance. Our repeated pleas to halt the advance so that we could consolidate the captured ground were turned down by the Supreme Command. Moreover, in his letter of instructions of March 20, 1942, the Supreme Commander insisted that we conduct our mission even more energetically. Following those instructions, the fronts of the Western Theatre of Operations attempted in late March and early April to crush the Rzhev-Vyazma grouping, but with no success. At last, the Supreme Command was compelled to accept our proposal to pass over to the defensive along the line running through Velikie Luki Velij Demidov Beli Dukhovshchina, the Dnieper Nelidovo Rzhev Pogoreloye Gorodishche Gzhatsk, the Ugra Spas Demensk Kirov Lyudinovo Kolmishchi the Oka. During the winter offensive, the forces of the Western Front had advanced from 70 to 100 kilometers, which somewhat improved the overall operational and strategic situation on the western sector. What were the overall results of the Great Battle of Moscow? In his account of Operation Typhoon, Nazi General Westphal had to admit that the German army, previously considered invincible, was on the brink of collapse. Many of Hitler's other former generals agreed, such as Tippelskirch, Blumentritt, Bayerlein and Manteuffel. In the Battle of Moscow, the Germans lost more than 500,000 officers and men, 1,300 tanks, 2,500 artillery pieces, over 15,000 motor vehicles, and a great deal more combat equipment. The enemy troops were rolled back west between 150 and 300 kilometers from Moscow. The 1941 to 1942 Soviet winter counteroffensive was conducted in difficult conditions, but even more important, as I already pointed out, without numerical superiority over the enemy. Besides, our fronts did not have full armoured and mechanized units, without which, as combat experience had shown, no large-scale, extensive offensive operations were possible. Only powerful armoured and mechanized forces can forestall enemy manoeuvres, swiftly outflank him, cut off his supply routes from the rear, and envelop and cut up his groupings. In the Battle of Moscow, the Red Army inflicted the first major defeat in the 6 months of the war on the Wehrmacht's main grouping. Before this, the Soviet armed forces had carried out several important operations that slowed the enemy's advance on all 3 directions of his main blow, but none of the operations was the equal, either in scope or outcome, of the great battle at the approaches to the Soviet capital. The skillful conduct of defensive operations, the well-timed execution of counterblows, and the prompt assumption of the counter-offensive were a substantial contribution to Soviet military science. They also testified to the Soviet military leaders' maturity in operational and strategic questions, and demonstrated the greater combat skill of men in all the fighting services. The result of the Battle of Moscow and the winter offensive by the Red Army showed that the German forces could be defeated, provided things were made difficult for them. The rout of the German troops on the approaches to Moscow was of great significance for the world. People in all the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition greatly rejoiced at the news of the marvellous victory by the Soviet forces. This victory inspired hope among progressives everywhere for deliverance from fascist slavery. The German setbacks near Leningrad, Rostov, and Tikhvin, and in the Battle of Moscow, had a sobering effect on reactionary circles in Japan and Turkey, and made them exercise more caution in their policies towards the Soviet Union. The German troops were now on the defensive. To restore their fighting efficiency, the Nazi military and political leadership had to take several extreme measures, as well as redeploy considerable forces from occupied countries of Europe and fling them into the Soviet German theatre. Germany had put pressure on the governments of the satellite countries so that they would send more troops and equipment to the east, and this aggravated the political situation in those countries. After the Nazi defeat near Moscow, many German officers and generals, to say nothing of the rank and file, became convinced that the Soviet Union was a mighty power and that the Soviet armed forces were an insurmountable obstacle in the way of the goals set by the Nazi military leaders. I am often asked about Stalin's role in the Battle of Moscow. Throughout the whole time, Stalin was in Moscow, organizing the troops and weapons for the enemy's defeat. As head of the State Committee for Defense, and with the help of the executive staff of the People's Commissariats, he must be given credit for the enormous work in organizing necessary strategic, material, and technical resources. By his strict exactingness, Stalin achieved, one can say, the near impossible. When I am asked what event in the last war rests most strongly in my memory, I always say, the Battle of Moscow. In grueling and often unbelievably difficult conditions, our troops matured, accumulating battle wisdom and experience. As soon as they received the minimum necessary technical resources, they turned from a retreating defensive into a powerful offensive force. Grateful generations to come will always remember the tremendous organizational work of the party, the heroic labor of the Soviet people, and the glorious feats of their armed forces. I would like to pay tribute to all who took part in the Battle of Moscow, and who survived, and to bow my head in deep respect to the memory of those who laid down their lives, but did not let the enemy through to the heart of our country, the hero city of Moscow. All of us owe them a debt of gratitude too great to be repaid. The Communist Party and the government lavished rewards on those who won the historic victory in grim 1941 against a formidable enemy. 36,000 officers and men were decorated during the period of the counteroffensive at Moscow and the Red Army's winter offensive. The title of Hero of the Soviet Union was awarded to 110 soldiers for special merit in combat. More than 1 million people earned the medal for the defense of Moscow. By a decree of the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet of May 8, 1965, Moscow was named a hero city and was decorated with the Order of Lenin and the Gold Star Medal. The remains of the unknown soldier, who laid down his life in defending the capital, have now been laid to rest beside the Kremlin wall. These words are inscribed on his tombstone: "Your name is unknown, your deed is immortal." The eternal flame of glory lit for the heroes who fell defending the capital will never be extinguished. It will serve forever as a reminder of the courage and heroism of the Soviet people who selflessly defended their socialist motherland. For a number of reasons, our country was once again subjected to severe trials in 1942, but as in 1941, during the Battle of Moscow, the Soviet people and their armed forces, led by the party of Lenin, overcame every setback with great courage. They routed the strategic concentration of German forces in the area between the Don and the Volga, thus setting the stage for the complete expulsion of the Nazi armies from our country. To understand the events that took place in the South, one must acquire at least a cursory knowledge of the military and political situation that developed at the beginning of the summer of 1942. The end of spring had seen some improvement in the Soviet Union's international and domestic situation. The anti-fascist front continued to expand and consolidate. In January, 26 countries signed a declaration agreeing to use all means at their disposal to combat the aggressor states and not to conclude any separate ceasefire or separate peace with them. An understanding was reached with the United States and Britain that a second front would be opened in Europe in 1942. All these factors, especially the defeat of the German forces at Moscow and the disruption of the plans for a blitzkrieg, gave a powerful boost to the anti-fascist forces in all countries. A lull had set in on the Soviet-German front. Both sides were on the defensive. The troops were digging trenches, building dugouts, mining the approaches to forward positions, erecting barbed wire entanglements, and carrying out other defense measures. Commanders and headquarters staffs were busy tightening up fire systems, coordinating the various services, and tackling other problems. The Stavka, the General Staff, and individual military units were summing up the results of the fighting, analysing and critically assessing successes and failures, and trying to gain deeper insight into the enemy's methods of warfare, as well as his strengths and weaknesses. The Soviet people, inspired by the Red Army's great victory at Moscow, which had laid the foundation for a fundamental turning point in the war, were making good headway in putting the economy on a war footing. Increasing quantities of new tanks, aircraft, artillery, rockets, and ammunition were reaching the armed forces. After the completion of the winter offensive, however, the Soviet armed forces were still markedly inferior to the enemy in numbers and equipment. At that time, we had no properly prepared reserves or substantial material resources. New strategic reserves for all the services had therefore to be built up in the rear. The successes of our tank and artillery industry enabled the Supreme Command to start forming tank corps and tank armies, equipped with the most up-to-date weapons of those days. Modernized 45mm anti-tank guns and new 76mm guns were coming into service. New artillery units and formations were being mustered. Anti-aircraft defences for the troops and the country as a whole were being organised on a grand scale. Our Air Force was able to start forming air armies, and by June we had 8 such armies. The long-range bomber formations were substantially reinforced. The total strength of the army in the field rose to 5.6 million men, 3,882 tanks, 44,900 guns and mortars, not counting 50mm mortars, of which we had 21,400, and 2,221 aircraft. Combat training was vastly expanded. The lessons of the recent fighting were mastered, and skill was acquired in handling the new weapons. The Nazi command was also preparing for its summer campaign, and still regarded the Eastern Front as the main theatre. The Nazi leaders sent more and more fresh forces eastward.